everyone. Today we're going to be continuing our read aloud of Ban This Book, and today we're going to be reading page 66 to page 85. Now, from the previous chapters, we realized that she's starting to kind of create this little library in her locker, and all of a sudden she decides that she has another even bigger idea. So we're going to see what that bigger idea is, and we'll see where the rest of the story then goes. So let's all start on page 66 together, and let's get started. The bigger idea. I cleared out the shelf of my locker. On it, I put my copies of From the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler and Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Shiver. Danny's copy of Wait Till Helen Comes and Rebecca's copy of It's Perfectly Normal, which I had only peeked at. Jonna let me have a couple of old Junie B. Jones books she had at home, and Danny got his friend Parker to donate his whole collection of Goosebumps books. When Jonna gave me back the Egypt game, I would have a total of 14 books. 14 books banned by Mrs. Spencer and her friends, free to borrow for any student who wanted to read them. And that's how the banned books locker library began. I still had 4 books to go to have all the banned books. Well, more than that, if you counted all the other Goosebumps and Junie B. Jones books and Captain Underpants books. But all I really still needed was Harriet the Spy, Matilda, Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, and a Captain Underpants book. Then I'd have at least one of everything on Mrs. Spencer's list. But Mrs. Spencer wasn't done. When I went to the school library after school to hide out in my usual spot until the late bus came, Mrs. Spencer was there. Today she was wearing one of those pink matching tracksuits that nobody really goes running in. And she had another list of books. More? Mrs. Jones said. Her face turned the same color as her orange and white polka dot dress. Honestly, Mrs. Spencer, have you read all these books? Have you read any of them? I pretended to be interested in the magazine rack near the front desk so I could listen. I don't need to read them, Mrs. Spencer said. Once I took my concerns to the school board, a member of other parents brought a number of books to my attention. I looked up reviews of the books online and decided these books weren't appropriate for an elementary school library. You decided, Mrs. Jones said. I didn't realize you had a library and information science degree. Mrs. Spencer stood up straighter. It added an inch to her height, but still not enough to come up to Mrs. Jones' level. I don't need a fancy library degree to know what's right and what's wrong for children. I see, Mrs. Jones said. Let me just get you some request for reconsideration forms then. That won't be necessary, Mrs. Spencer said. I've already spoken to members of the school board about these books, and they agree that they have no place at Shelbourne Elementary. Well, Mrs. Jones said, be that as it may, until I hear from the school board, these books will stay on the shelf. She handed the list back to Mrs. Spencer. I see, Mrs. Spencer said. She looked at the list for a moment and then smiled sweetly. You know, before I go, I think I'll pick out some books to check out for Trey. Mrs. Jones smiled back. Anything I can do to help? No, thanks, Mrs. Spencer said. She held up a piece of paper with a new book she wanted to ban written on it. I have a list. I knew what Mrs. Spencer was doing, so did Mrs. Jones. Mrs. Spencer was going to check out all the books on her new list, so no one else could check them out until the school board told Mrs. Jones to take them off the shelf. And there was nothing Mrs. Jones could do about it. For the next 15 minutes, Mrs. Spencer went through the shelves and collected every single book on her list. I couldn't watch, but I also couldn't hide out in my favorite spot. Trey was sitting in it, drawing in his notebook. I pulled up short, as shocked as I had been when Mrs. Frankweiler had gone missing. I felt the heat rise in my face. First, Trey's mom had banned my favorite book from the library, and now Trey was sitting in my library seats, and I still hadn't forgiven him for what he did to me in 3rd grade. My fist clenched at the hem of my skirt, but I slipped away down a row of books before he could look up and see me. Mrs. Spencer finally came up to the counter with a huge armful of books, and Mrs. Jones had no choice but to check them out to her in Trey's name. Trey, it's time to go, Mrs. Spencer said. He collected his stuff and left my spot at last. On the way out, he glanced up and saw me watching him from behind a big potted plants. I stuck my tongue out at him, but he just chuckled. That odious woman, Mrs. Jones said, when they had gone. This all started when she didn't like the Captain Underpants book Trey checked out. She gave me an exasperated sigh. But then she seemed to get an idea, she smiled to herself, and went into the office in the back. The one with all the windows, got on the computer. While Mrs. Jones wasn't looking, I snatched the list Mrs. Spencer had left on the counter and dashed out of the library. I needed it. Every time Mrs. Spencer took a book from the school library, I was going to add a book to my secret library. All right, so I want you to stop and think for a second before we move on to the next chapter and think about, what do you think of Mrs. Spencer's actions? Do you think she's doing the right thing? Do you think she's doing the wrong thing? Do you think that she's trying to do the right thing? Or do you think she's doing this just to be mean to the other kids? So what are your thoughts on Mrs. Spencer's actions? And then what do you think is going to happen with Amy Ann's locker with all of these books in it? And now that she has this new list, what's going to happen with that? So let's continue on with the next chapter on page 71, Violent Criminals. Standing next to my locker a few days later was a third grader wearing a tan trench coat with the lapels turned up. He wore sunglasses and his brown hair looked like a comb hadn't touched a kid's head in days. Psst, psst, he said. You Amy Ann Ollinger? Yeah, who are you? Weeby, he said. Nikolai Weeby. He leaned closer. The red dog barks at midnight, he whispered. What? He frowned. It's a code, a spy code. Well, it's not a very good code if only one of us knows it, I thought, but I didn't say it. The boy sighed. I'm looking for a book, a secret book, a spy book. You mean Harriet the Spy? Shh, he said. He glanced around like there were spies everywhere. It's checked out, I told him. I opened the BBLL, the banned books locker library, to show him. There were only 6 books left on the shelf. Everything else had been checked out, and even after I've added another 12 books from Mrs. Spencer's new list, mostly with Danny's help, he knew all kinds of people who had copies at home. I can put you on the list, I told Nikolai. I pulled out the clipboard where people could reserve a book and had him add his name. Whenever someone turned a book back in, I went through the list and found the next person who wanted it, and then left them a note in their locker mailbox saying it was ready for pickup. My own locker mailbox had 3 notes in it, all from different people in my class, and all asking to read one of the books. My locker mailbox was getting a lot more use lately. You should have a list, Nikolai said, of all the books you have, so people know what they can check out. And do what? Hang it on the outside of my locker with a sign that says, here's all the books we're not supposed to read that I have hidden in my locker, I wanted to say. Instead, I said, I'll think about it. Nikolai pulled a pen out of his pocket and talked into it like it was a microphone. Abort mission. Repeat. Abort mission. Alert. Ukrainian intelligence. The package is not in the locker. Repeat. Not in the locker. I closed my locker and saw someone watching me from behind another locker door farther down the hall. It was Trey. There really were spies everywhere. Hey, I got you a new one, Danny said, making me jump. Nikolai was gone, and Danny stood in his place. With one hand, he combed his helmet of hair into the exact place he wanted it, and with the other, he slid me a beat-up old paperback copy of My Brother Sam is Dead. I squeaked and stuck the book up under my shirt. I glanced down the hall. Trey was gone. Had he seen Danny give me the book? If he didn't, the first thing he would do is run and tell his mom. I popped one of my braids in my mouth and sucked on it. Sorry, Danny said. I thought you'd be excited. Yeah, I'm sorry, I told him. I pulled the book out and put it quickly into my locker. It was one of the books off Mrs. Spencer's new list, and I didn't have. JV's old brother had a copy of it, Danny said. He thinks he might have bridged to Terabithia around somewhere, too. He's going to look for it this weekend. I'll let you know. I didn't understand why Danny was so into finding all the books on this list. He wasn't interested in reading them all like I was. I thanked him anyway and put the book in my locker. We had to get to class. Have you read any of the Wayside School books? I asked him. I think you'd like them. They're really funny. Danny flicked his hair into place. Cool. I didn't know you had those. I'll pick one up after school. We went into Mr. Vaughn's class, and he walked with me to my desk. Rebecca was already sitting in the desk beside mine. Hey, you've got so many books now, you need a list, Danny whispered. You know, to let everybody know what's in the BBLL. I know, I told him. Nikolai said the same thing. Right, and what's she supposed to do? Tape it to the front of her locker? Rebecca said. She gets caught, and it's lawsuit time. I felt a quicksand opening up underneath me again. Lawsuit time? Sure, from all the parents whose children you've corrupted. Why do you think they banned all those books to begin with? Because the parents think they're going to rot our brains and turn us into violent criminals. Danny ran his fingers through his hair. I don't know about you guys, but ever since I read Wait Till Helen Comes, I've been thinking about worshiping Satan. He's got some really good ideas. Don't joke. This is serious, I said. Is this serious, Rebecca? Aw, come on, Danny said. Nobody's gonna sue you. Suspend you, maybe, but not sue you. Definitely suspended, Rebecca agreed. The quicksand turned into water, and I sank to the bottom desk and all. All right, we're moving on to the next chapter, but real quick, I want you guys to think about, have you actually read any of these books that have been mentioned in this book so far? Because any of the books that you see in italics, that means those slanted words, any books you see like that is a real book that has been banned at some point at some school. So I want you to think, have you read any of these books before? Like Goosebumps, Junie B. Jones, Wayside School, things like that. So there are some really good books out there that a lot of us really like, but why are they being banned? So I want you to think about, why have these books been banned? Should they be banned? Would you want to see these books banned? So think about these questions as we continue reading. All right, we're on page 76 now, and this chapter is called Juvenile Delinquents. And you may have heard of this word before. All through math, I stuck to my braids and imagined all the awful things that would happen if I was caught with all these books in my locker. Every parent at Shelbourne Elementary would line up to sue me. My dad would lose his bricklaying business. My mom would lose her job. We'd have to sell our house and move to a different city. My sisters would have to be sold to medical research companies. Well, it wouldn't be all so bad. I was overreacting, and I knew it. What I was doing wasn't exactly illegal. The school board had just said that Mrs. Jones couldn't loan out these books. They didn't say I couldn't. I still wanted to loan out the books, but I didn't want to get caught. So how was I going to let people know what books I had to check out? If I didn't have a way of telling the other kids what I had, they wouldn't know how to ask for them, and nobody would read them. Then it would all be for nothing. And then I had it. Why not tape a list of the books that I had in my locker? I just didn't have to call it that. During language arts, I used one of the computers to type up a list, and I taped it to my locker after school. At the top, in big capital letters, it said, "Books banned at Shelbourne Elementary." Underneath that was every one of the books Mrs. Spencer and the other parents had taken off the shelves, with a little green dot from a green magic marker next to all the books I had in the BBLL. Once everybody knew how to read it, I could just add a new green dot to any book that got added. Presto! Looking at the list again, I realized there were still a lot of books I needed to add, and Danny was running out of people to ask. What I needed was money to buy books. Bake sale, Rebecca said. Of course, I said, a bake sale. Every time we wanted to raise money to help build a well in Africa or to support the Red Cross after a hurricane, we had a bake sale. All I had to do was tell my dad we were having another bake sale at school, and he picked up a brownie mix at the store without even asking what it was for. Same with Rebecca's mom. Rebecca and I set up our plastic wrapped brownies and chocolate chip cookies in a basket on a table in the cafeteria and started raking in the moolah. The first day we made $7.50. I was counting out the quarters again when Rebecca nudged me. What? I said. Rebecca nudged me again, harder. What? I said. I looked up and saw Principal Banana coming right for us. Her name isn't Principal Banana, of course. It's Benazuski, but none of the kindergartners could ever pronounce her name right, so she let them call her Principal Banana. As fourth graders, we were supposed to call her Principal Benazuski, though. Principal Benazuski reminded me of a police detective from one of those TV mysteries. She wore gray suits and black leather shoes, and she always had a walkie-talkie on her belt, and her school ID in a plastic holder pinned to her jacket like a badge. I expected her to yell, "Freeze, punk, you're under arrest," every time I saw her. Instead, she looked over our selection of desserts and said, "Looks good, ladies. What's the cause?" What? I said. "What are you raising money for?" Principal Benazuski asked. Her walkie-talkie squawked, and she turned down the volume on it without looking at it. delinquents. I pulled a braid around and chewed on it. Uh, I said. I looked at Rebecca. Her eyes went wide and she shook her head. I stammered. We couldn't tell her what her bake sale was really for. I was going to have to make something up. What had our last bake sale been for? I couldn't remember. With Detective Benesuski staring at me, I couldn't think of anything. We're raising money for books, I said. Books? Principal Benesuski said. Rebecca gawked at me. Books for prisoners, I said, for them to read in prison. Books for prisoners, Principal Benesuski said. Kid prisoners, kids our age, who are in jail. Under the table, Rebecca started hitting me in the leg with her fist. You mean juvenile delinquents? Principal Benesuski said. Yes, I said. Juvenile delinquents. We're raising money to buy books for juvenile delinquents. That sounded good. Well, that's very noble of you, Principal Benesuski said. I'll take 2 cookies. She handed over $1, and I had to kick Rebecca to get her to open her eyes and take the money. Rebecca turned on me the second Principal Benesuski was gone. Books for kid prisoners to read in jail, she said. Well, what was I supposed to say, I said. We're raising money for the homeless, or the animal shelter, or the food bank. Where were all those great ideas when she was asking? I said. Well, I thought you would think of something else besides, what we're actually raising money for, Rebecca said. Oh, yeah, I said. Well, you just wait till Helen comes, and then you'll be sorry for picking on me. Rebecca and I started bursting out laughing. I'm sorry, all right. Every time I see Principal Banana, I think of the police. It makes me nervous. Well, at least you didn't lie to her, Rebecca said. We are raising money to buy books for juvenile delinquents. Us. This next chapter is called Helen Comes. There was another school board meeting the next month. I didn't go, but I knew what happens. Mrs. Jones argued again that none of the books should be removed from the library, but the school board still agreed with Mrs. Spencer. All the books from her second list were officially banned. The very next day in social studies, Mr. Vaughn told us we were going to start studying the Bill of Rights. The Founding Fathers wrote the Constitution to explain how the new American government would work. But then they realized they needed an extra part to talk about all the freedoms Americans automatically got that the government couldn't take away from them. That's what the Bill of Rights is. It's 10 amendments that protect the natural rights of all citizens. The Constitution was important because it told the world how we were going to run our governments, Mr. Vaughn said. The Bill of Rights might be even more important, though, because it said what our new country was going to be about. It said, here are the rights we think are so important that no one can take them away from us, not even the government. We added a lot more later on, but the first 10 are very famous. It was the first document of its kind in the world, and this is real. The Bill of Rights is a real thing, and I want you to think about, why did the author decide to include this information about the Bill of Rights in this chapter? Because we're going to keep talking about this, and this project's going to continue into the book. But I want you to think about, what's the point of the author talking about this Bill of Rights? And what does it have to do with the overall story? All right, let's continue at the top of page 82. For this social studies unit, I'm going to split you up into pairs, Mr. Vaughn told us. Each team will study a different amendment. Your assignment will be to give a presentation to the class that explains what your amendment means. How you do that, what kind of presentation you give, is up to you. Rebecca's hand shot up. Mr. Vaughn, can I do the 6th Amendment, please? Sure, Rebecca, Mr. Vaughn said. He erased something in his notes and wrote in something new. I looked at Rebecca like she was crazy. The 6th Amendment is the right to trial by jury, she told me, and the right to counsel. Does anyone else have a favorite amendment they want to do? Mr. Vaughn asked. Not surprisingly, no one else did. All right, Mr. Vaughn said. Jonna, I want you and Tracy to make the 5th Amendment. Kevin, you and Danny take the 2nd Amendment. I tuned out while Mr. Vaughn gave the other assignments. Rebecca and I had made another $7 in our most recent bake sale, and I was trying to decide whether to buy How to Eat Fried Worms or Anne Frank's The Diary of a Young Girl. They were really hard to compare. Amy Ann, Mr. Vaughn said, are you with us? Sorry, I said. Beside me, I could sense Rebecca's eyes boring into me, but I focused on Mr. Vaughn. I said, I'm assigning you and Trey the 1st Amendment. That all right? Was that all right? Was I all right with working on my social studies project with the son of my arch enemy, the boy who would rat me out the second I slipped up and mentioned the BBLL? No, I was definitely not all right with that. But instead I said, okay, all right, everybody, get together with your partner and start reading about your amendments, Mr. Vaughn said. I'll be coming around to help. Everybody else got up and put their desks together. I sat where I was and made Trey drag his desk all the way across the room to mine. He parked it right up he parked it right up against mine with a thud, making my pencil pop out of its little ditch. Trey stared at his closed notebook. I crossed my arms and stared at my textbook. You don't like me much, do you? Trey asked. I wanted to laugh. Don't like you much? I wanted to say. Oh, why would that be, Trey? Maybe because besides your mom banning my favorite book, you drew that awful picture of me last year. Trey likes to draw. That's his thing. And I hated to admit it, but he was really good. He was so good that last year when Trey and I were both in Mrs. Maples' room, he decided he would draw each of us as animals. Mrs. Maples was a wise old maple tree. Kenny Haskins, who was good at soccer, he drew as a cheetah. Lavina Maddox, who wanted to be a singer when she grew up, he drew as a songbird. Daniel Farid, who loved the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, he drew as a Ninja Turtle. Everybody loved the pictures he drew of them. Except me. The picture Trey drew of Amy Ann Ollinger was a mouse sitting on a book, chewing its tail. He didn't draw me as a cheetah or a ninja turtle or a songbird. He drew me as a wimpy little mouse. Trey bent his head down to look up at me, and I realized I hadn't said anything for a long time. Listen, Amy Ann, he said at last. The room intercom crackled to life, making both of us jump. Mr. Vaughn? The secretary said, I'm sorry for the interruption, but can we please see Jeffrey Gonzalez and Amy Ann Ollinger in the office? Ooh, the rest of the class said. Everybody always did that anytime anybody got called to the office, like you were in big trouble. Even if it was just because you had a dentist appointment. But this time, they knew they might be right. Half the eyes in the room were on me, and I knew why. They all knew I ran the BBLL, and they were all thinking the exact same thing I was. Amy Ann is busted. I'll send them right along, Mrs. Perry, Mr. Vaughn said, motioning at the same time for us to get a move on. My legs felt like jello as I stood. Across the room, Rebecca and Danny's faces looked like they had just seen Helen's ghost by the pond. I didn't know how I was even going to walk to the door without collapsing. I put my hand on Trey's desk to steady myself, and he looked up at me. Hope you're not in trouble, he says. And that is the end of this chapter. So 5th grade, this is going to be the end of this video, but I just want to let you all know that in the next video that you guys are going to see for next week's week of summer school, you are not going to see me reading this book anymore. You're going to see another teacher and reading this book, and I will be teaching another subject because all the teachers are going to be kind of rotating the subjects throughout summer school. So next week you're going to see me in a different type of video, and you'll see another teacher reading this book. So I hope you guys really enjoyed this book so far. I know that I am, and I look forward to seeing you in whatever my next video is. So have a great day, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye.